I think for me that is the bottom line of I feel like so much of contemporary culture is sort of living in this existential bubble. It's like, no, the bottom line is if we destroy our ecological environment, we can't keep living. There's a threshold, there is an existential threshold in which a certain way of operating on the earth leads to our death as a species. It's not even an intellectual sort of it's not a debate. It's like, I need oxygen to breathe, we need foods to eat. It's not, it has become this political argument and even a sort of battle of religious perspectives. And at the end of the day, it's like, well, if this way of living brings us to our fundamental destruction, we got to pause. Like, do we want to just walk off this cliff being right? Or do we want to sort of adapt to the information we're getting from the world that this way of being in the world doesn't work? And unfortunately, it feels like many of us would just rather die being right.
Dylan, pleasure to have you today, man.
It's great to be here.
Are you ready to solve all the world's problems?
No.
Yeah, me neither. But I'm very excited to at least explore. For those listening, Dylan and I have had a few conversations, and he's one of those people that every time I talk to him, it's an ease to talk to him. It's a pleasure. It's enjoyable. He's full of wisdom, but not just wisdom. There's something about the capacity to hold information and to sit with different ideas and thoughts that I've just thoroughly enjoyed. So I think you guys are going to really enjoy this conversation. To start, I want to give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself just briefly, share what you do, and where you're kind of coming from on your journey.
Perfect. Thank you, Trey. Very kind words. My name is Dylan Francisco. I am an assistant professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California. Currently co-chair of the Jungian and Archetypal Studies Master's and Ph.D. program. I have a mixed Mexican-European ancestry, which is a big part of my approach to teaching at Pacifica, and includes really focusing on Indigenous traditions, decolonialism, and different avenues, angles of looking at modern concerns, issues we're facing culturally, particularly in the Western America, looking at the assumptions we make about that govern how we respond to our major concerns and what's going on in the world. And so, I attempt in my own life to speak in a way and think in a way that is related to how we actually live and where these issues actually touch us and hit our families, hit our emotional lives, hit how we treat the world and others. And that's really how I try to orient to academia in general, which is itself sort of not the norm in academia, but my own way of critiquing those norms is bringing education back to life where we have to actually live.
Yeah, that's I've noticed that a lot in my dissertation and in my PhD studies with the work that I do with the imaginal and the symbolic and the practice of working with archetypes, working with energies. I find that there is a lot of times either it's either scholarly, or when you go outside of the academics framework, you find kind of the practitioners and the people that are doing it. And very rarely do those worlds collide. And if they do, it's not super accessible to find these people. And that's an interesting dilemma. I mean, I think people are aware that people have talked about academic spaces, having that issue for a while, but it seems to be more problematic in topics like what you're talking about, because this is getting into a little bit of the deeper weeds as to when the subject matter requires it. Now you're in kind of an interesting situation. Which is why I'm excited to talk to you, because I do think, for me, I've really enjoyed listening to the indigenous perspectives, to the animistic perspectives, which is what we're going to get into today. But I think the big thing that I'm always left with is wrestling with this idea of what does the emergence of that begin to look like within modernity. And with some of the things coming down the pipeline, I think that it's important for us to know. And I mean, we can see it in the world with all the stuff happening, which we'll get into today, but we're being faced by these issues, and the tools that we have can oftentimes be a little bit limiting.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, one of the biggest issues is our view of history itself, which sounds very abstract, but I think in the West, we've just been fundamentally trained into a strictly linear view of time in which the past is gone and we're sort of always living for the next thing and the new thing. And again, from an Indigenous perspective, it's not as if there aren't events past and present and future, but the past is never lost. Our ancestors are living. The earth remains what she is in relationship to us. And so I think part of our grappling with how do we return might not be the right word, but recover or reconnect with ways of being, ways of thinking that may be more harmonious in relationship to the human community and the more than human world, I think requires us to deconstruct a little bit our sense that all of that stuff is far away and gone and impossible to tap into. I think, at least for me, one of the values of depth psychology is its view that the psyche itself sort of enfolds our history, our ancestral experiences, and they are sort of inherited in time with us as we sort of enter the world. And therefore, even if we're not conscious of it, those layers of experience and wisdom and ways of being are still somewhere in us, available should we learn how to get there.
Yeah. Well, and I want to get in this conversation, I want to get into AI. I want to get into the archetypes, but I want to start, I think, while, with your background and your knowledge, I want to kind of lay a foundation and start with animism, because I don't think you can talk about indigenous practices without animism. And I also think that from my experience in modern culture and the zeitgeist of today, when people that I talk to, I think animism is one of those things that is so misunderstood and maybe just ignored or not talked about. I don't see it in the discourse a lot. And I'm curious, could you lay out a little bit of a foundation of what is animism and why is it important, and why is it relevant and not superstitious to talk about? Like, why is, I would argue it's necessary to talk about. So I'm wondering if you could kind of lay out just briefly what that is and why is it relevant to this conversation?
Yeah, I'll start with, animism itself is a loaded term and sort of grew out of anthropological studies of primitive cultures, as they were called in most, early foundational anthropological literature. But the view was that indigenous cultures, ancient communities experience and relate to the world as itself inhabited by intelligences, agencies, beings that have their own sort of perspective and capacity to engage with us. And that sort of goes from top to bottom, from rocks and minerals to plants and animals, to even the things humans construct, from their homes to their boats to their tools. There's nothing left out of the circle of consciousness, to use that word. And there's a simultaneous sort of unity to existence in which sort of the whole cosmos is alive and conscious, and each particular thing has its share in that consciousness and capacity to act and relate. And so it's a very holistic frame of reference in which everything around you and across the division between made and natural things, everything is alive and capable of speaking and interacting. Of course, this was originally positioned as what a sort of ignorant, unconscious view of the world. It's projecting human psychology onto existence. I think at least in academic circles, that assumption has been deeply challenged by quantum physics and sort of the inseparability of consciousness from material existence and their interactivity and responsiveness to each other. So, however much that satisfies sort of the skepticism of indigenous perspectives, it's there. But I also think animism is a very natural, spontaneous way humans feel towards the world, and it's something we have to be talked out of.
Yeah.
But if you watch children, if you watch most, even adults who are very rational and educated, put them in a dark forest at night and there's something that comes alive of like, what did I hear? What's speaking? What's going on? Who's
Right.
present?
Yeah.
There's something in our bones that is animistic to me.
It's also funny how I know if you ever notice when you watch if people stub their toe or
Yeah.
if their computer starts breaking, what do they immediately start
Yeah.
talking to the computer or
Correct.
personifying the rock. But one of the things I'm interested in, and I think this is where I go back and forth with kind of my thought on it, because I think you're right, quantum physics, but not just quantum physics. I mean, even the whole hard problem, the Chalmers, the whole hard
Correct.
problem of consciousness. And if we look at consciousness studies, it's a huge thing that people are ignoring within the materialistic framework, because at the end of the day, like 99% of every person that's ever existed, if you go back to the beginning of time, has had an animistic perspective towards existence. And not
Yeah.
until Cartesian logic towards today's time, where, just recently in history, have people begin to have this dualistic split um, from from seeing things with this life force. Now we can unpack this, because I don't think it means everything has a mind like mind. But I think when we think about consciousness emerging and the types of energies that are flowing through things, I think that to whatever level, or even like a relational ontology of the emotions and the energies that we're putting towards these things that are very real. I'm wondering, because I like you, it's like I see some amazing work being done within the scientific community. I talk a lot about Michael Levin and cellular biologist, and the work he's doing that's like hard science that's showing, hey, look, the universe is much different than what we're trying
Correct.
to make it out to be, and it's going to change rapidly.
Yeah.
And I think he's kind of blowing the whistle here in hopes to kind of allow us to reorient, and because I think this is not just a fun thing to believe. It's necessary that we establish, like, that we bring harmony back to this relationship for many reasons. But I'm curious, like, to get your thoughts on just the necessary, the bridges that science has to play to bring us back. Because
Yeah.
the Enlightenment took us into this,
Yeah.
and it's almost like when I talk to people, if you come with certain words or labels or ways of speaking, that framework, that mental framework has been so built up that in the
Correct.
Western psyche, that's almost like feels impenetrable to these concepts and these ideas. It's almost
Yeah.
like I feel like a systematic undoing or unwinding has to occur in order for people to start to engage with the symbolic, engage with the imaginal, engage with the animistic
Yeah.
forces in a way that feels authentic. And so I'm just curious as to like what your experience, if that makes sense, what, if you speak on what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I think sort of collective culture, at least in the West, is living off of old science that, like, in sort of current physics, biology, consciousness studies, like, has been so fundamentally deepened and even replaced that we are often arguing against a scientific framework that scientists are not even operating in anymore. And it's so we're sort of having to inhabit a frame of reference that is occupying people's minds that is no longer in actual fact an operational framework in scientific circles. And I think the more, the value of that information, I think, will come as it continues to saturate popular culture, in which it's like, yeah, the sort of mechanistic, materialistic assumptions of science are not even assumptions of science anymore. We can't assume that there is the sort of hard building block things hitting against each other, and like all of that has been well critiqued and discarded because of, it seems, the deeper we look, the more we find this inseparability of consciousness and the cosmos. And even more than that, the complexity of cells, of neurological functioning, of the intelligence of plants, and the way things are sort of communicating with their environments. The depth of that information that science is drawing out is so incredibly congruent with an animistic perspective. That information gap just hasn't been filled, but in collective culture. But to me, it has in scientific circles, where you can't talk about matter as some isolated thing anymore. You have to talk about energy, fields, consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is now so fundamentally challenged the status quo that almost everyone's having to reconfigure how they think about the world, because consciousness now has to be included in the way we frame how anything exists.
Yeah. I think of it, it has to be repositioned. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like we put it at the byproduct, at the end of the chain,
Yeah.
or at the top of the pyramid. It's like, hey, this is in a causal chain of
Correct.
event from the brain. And I think we've never been able to prove that. We just kind of assumed like that's
Yeah.
where it's gotta be. And then I think now people are starting, like you said, people are starting to realize like it doesn't work there. Fundamentally,
No.
it's not congruent. And so I feel like the shift of placing it as a foundational building block, as at the bottom of the pyramid, and then
Correct.
if we start having a paradigm of consciousness is fundamental, that's animism. That's
Yeah.
in a nutshell, right? Like that would
Yeah.
be an easy way of saying animism. It's like the fundamental foundational quality of consciousness.
Yeah.
And what I find is when you make that subtle shift, to a lot of people that might not seem that significant, or it might not seem like, okay, what's the big deal? But when you really start unpacking it, like that opens up a world of new discovery, a world of new exploration. Things like telepathy you can repackage
Right.
these paranormal anomalous phenomena, like these things that we haven't been able to describe and explain now become, becomes it something that we have the ability to build frameworks around and understanding. So it almost feels like, for me, I get the sense that the container is the modernity, the modern society. The container seems to be kind of fracturing.
Yeah.
It seems to be kind of breaking. And where do we go from there? Like, what happens? I mean, obviously, like that's a big question.
Yes. I mean, it seems like there usually is sort of at least two responses, which is sort of panic about sort of losing our orientation and sort of trying to rebuild it or hold on to it tighter. And this is where fundamentalisms of all variety come in, of like, now we just sort of have to circle the wagons because our perspective is being attacked and we have to defend it at all costs. So we're going to exclude any information that doesn't affirm what we already think. I also think that there can be a leap towards sort of a reconfirmation of our linear narrative of like, oh, this is the new shiny object. This is fun to play with. This is interesting. But I think that the far more fundamental value of this and potential way of responding to it is I do think it fundamentally changes how we treat the world. And I think that is where for me, the great catastrophe of the Cartesian split between mind is in human beings and everything else is this sort of meaningless, dead, mute material
Yeah.
stuff that is ours for the doing of whatever we want with it. To me, that is, if you get at the bottom of how most people operate in the world, the human has value and everything else is in service to what humans want to do with it. And for me, that assumption, that way of categorizing existence has been at the root of the major issues, especially revolving around ecology that we're facing. Because for me, there's something about human beings in which as soon as you erase the consciousness of anything else, we feel permission to do whatever we like to that. Contrast, I think as soon as someone authentically experiences and senses and has a regained sense that the things around them have some sort of not human, but some sort of mind agency livingness, it puts a pause on the way we treat that thing. We can no longer just dismiss it as for me. It has its own life that now we have to take into consideration. And I think that is a fundamental ethical reorientation.
Yeah, you go out of the shift from the having mode to the being mode,
Yeah.
where you're kind of a part of it, or you see yourself as a part of the chain, which I think is interesting because there's two places I want to go, and I'm not sure where to go first because I think AI is a really interesting hot topic right now that a lot of people are thinking about that.
Yeah.
They're thinking about how am I positioning myself towards this emerging technology and towards this emerging world, a world that is is changing. Like it's just changing. And I don't there's no other way around it. And I think that it's not just AI, it's not just LLMs and AI, AGI and so forth, but it is the entire arena and the landscape that that starts to inform and change. And I think what you said something earlier where it like threatens that dominance or that feeling that we've been able to conquer the land and control these certain technologies to a certain point. And as they begin to threaten that notion, I think that's where a lot of the restlessness of the fear of what are we going to do? How are we going to approach this? It doesn't seem like to me, it doesn't feel like a relational conversation at all. It feels like how am I going to wrestle this event, this technology, this happening into a paradigm that I already hold.
Correct.
Right? But I think that seems challenging because I'm like, it seems like a losing, I don't see where a person wins in that other than just making themselves feel better for a day. So maybe through this, we can offer alternative ways of looking at this that could be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think AI is basically, if we haven't known it yet, it's sort of provoking our colonialism, for lack of a better word. And what I mean by that is it is bringing to the surface the fact that humans view themselves as the superior thing in existence. And therefore, the conversation is how do we control? How do we maintain dominance? How do we protect ourselves against? And so, in the texture of the language around AI, to me, shows that we are finding ourselves witnessing something that is threatening to that, which exposes that that's how we assume the world should work, that humans are the pinnacle of existence, and therefore, how do we stay on top? Completely agree with you that has already not been working. That is what has created our dysregulation in relationship to our natural environment. And so that response to me just reinscribes the same problematic positionality of humans being the center and top of the world. And that's one of the reasons I value the emergence of AI, because in some ways, although it feels like a constant landscape of change and new things,
Disruption.
for me, it actually brings us back into a kind of sensibility in which we are not the only intelligences at work in the world. And therefore, what does that mean for us? How do we define ourselves now in a way that can't assume that human minds are the only intelligent operating beings in existence? And if we listen to that question, I think that can heal us of some of this superiority complex that we're finding threatened right now by AI.
Yeah, and it feels like even that mindset, and I just feel like the conversation is consistently, at least most of the conversations that I hear are consistently people trying to, well, AI is just this, or like, the
Yeah.
Turing test, or like it's just a consistent trying to make this make sense within the ego
Yeah.
or within the
Yeah.
mind. And it doesn't feel like it's the same thing with like trying to find consciousness at the top of the pyramid. We can wrestle with that, but like we're going to exhaust ourselves as
Yeah.
opposed to taking a step back and saying, let's ask different questions.
Yeah.
Let's approach it differently. Let's build. That's why I firmly believe this conversation it has to be embedded in an archetypal and animistic framework with the initiatory mindset, because if it's not, we have no way of building relationship. We have no
No.
way of understanding platonic forms or archetypal images or things that are a part of this reality. And what it feels like to me is that, going back to the beginning of our conversation, the modern zeitgeist is stuck in a framework that is no longer, it's like people that were living during Einstein's time. It's like they're living with the current reality. Einstein has this idea that will change so much, but no one knows. Like there's a lag
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
So I think of it the same way, where it's like most people I talk to have no idea the tools that are needed for what's coming down the pipeline, and it seems like the things that are coming don't care. It's like
Yeah.
we're coming.
Correct.
We're coming whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where I look at the imaginal and the symbolic and animism, and I'm like, this is very necessary to have conversations around what it is, and to at least try on an archetypal lens,
Yeah.
an animistic lens with this conversation, because without it, I don't see any other way. I don't see any
Yeah.
other way that we come out of it in many
No,
ways.
I mean, in the way it's being framed as sort of like who's going to win, basically, us or AI, it's a zero-sum game, and I think it's a losing game. Uh, for the for if no other reason, I myself view the technology as having a sort of autonomous essence that we keep thinking we're in control of, but I don't think we are. And so if we're not positioning ourselves in antagonistic relationships with AI and other minds, if there's going to be a hierarchy that comes out of it, we're not going to be we're going to lose that game. And so, and I just think it fundamentally tells us that, in my perspective, that sort of the humanist agenda is going to fail, which is we are the only unique things again in creation. And that idea has just, for me, made us fundamentally sick. It has divorced us from every other sort of extension of human community, of animal, plant, and the world as a whole. And that hasn't worked well for us. So if we're going to change that relationship, we have to inhabit a different kind of world in which those other beings are part of the way we exist. And therefore, in that kind of world, human minds are just one kind of mind in relationship to other minds. And to return again to sort of indigenous perspectives, and as you said earlier, this is the way humans have inhabited the world for 99% of history, in which we simply existed in relationship to other beings with minds of their own kind. So it's not a sort of radically different cosmos. It's something we've inhabited before, and I think inhabited better in terms of actually living in sustainable, harmonious ways in which every being has its place in the sort of service to the whole. But until we, right now, that seems such a far stretch of a kind of cosmos to inhabit, but we're reaching a point at which this train track ends, and this way of framing existence of we're going to battle this out to the end, we're going to lose that battle. So we have an opportunity, I think, a brief opportunity to really challenge the assumptions of that frame of reference and try, as you said, try on like a way of being that has served us well in the past and
Yeah.
serves living communities now well.
I think people are feeling it and they're feeling the need for it. I think a lot of the resistance that will be happening with many people that have come out of either a religious organization or some kind of spiritual practice in the West, they've saw the limitations of it. I think that there is a hesitancy or a resistance to adopt any type of fully formed
Correct.
ontological, like metaphysical worldview. And so I get that. And I think that's where I want to make sure we're careful, because I think that sometimes these types of conversations that we're having around animism and these indigenous perspectives gets looked at as the equivalent of some fully formed, spiritual practice or belief in a god or a sectarian religious perspective or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
And that's not what we're talking about at all. Like
Right.
it's not a religious perspective, so to say, or a dogmatic or a belief system to adopt or propositional belief.
Yeah.
That's not what we're
Correct.
talking about. But I think, and just to ground this for people listening, and I think this is why I think this conversation is so exciting, is because we talk about the science. And going back to Levin's work, there's a video I'll post for anybody interested in really diving into this. But he does work at a cellular level, works with these things called Xenobots and anthrobots, which are just like some are frog embryos, and then some are like genetically engineered cells, in which they're able to manipulate cells through ion RA channels, and that's just electricity, right? So they're just communicating messages of what they want to do, what they want the cell to do. And what they're finding is, as they construct these environments for these cells, one example that they had was they had a frog, and they got the frog embryo. They sent a message that they wanted the frog, as it was in a cellular production of, like, making the eyes and the tails and the back or whatever. They sent a message to this cell to grow an eye on its back. And so what it did was it received that message, and then it started organizing itself and communicating this message to other cells around it, in which an eye began to grow on the frog's back. And they did this with an anthrobot, where they took a cell from someone that was dead or had passed away, and they put it in a new environment, and it retained the information that it operated from as a cell in that body, and then began to construct new things in new ways that was not connected to a Darwinian evolutionary causal chain of, like, this cell is doing this because of millennia of what it's been learned. It was actually pulling information from a space that he's actually calling, this is what he's saying, platonic spaces.
Yeah.
So it's essentially like pulling from this form of a non-physical space that we're not seeing, in order to complete a task, construct something that is in real time very much novel. So
Right.
here's what that means, and this is what he said that I think is so cool that relates to this AI conversation. He says that it's not so much about looking at the cell as being conscious as the way you and I are conscious, but it's looking at these things as we're constructing a set or an arena in which these how do you say it, a mechanism in which as we boot it up, it creates a platform for these platonic forms and for these types of archetypal energies start to emerge. So basically, when I think about that and I look at AI, regardless of whether or not the actual LLM is conscious or not, in the way that we're currently looking at it, the more that we boot up certain types of
Right.
technologies, whatever the capacity that we have that we give them, in a sense, opens up those channels for which a consciousness can kind of flow through. And again,
Yeah.
not the type of consciousness that that makes a human, but nonetheless an influential archetypal pattern that will have an effect on both society and individuals.
Right.
Which it's like it's right there. Like what we're talking about is not this. It's
Correct.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean,
What I think is really fascinating is like, I think there are a lot of people in which this kind of information would be like, that's not happening, because it I think makes them think of, oh, well, this is telling us that everything science previously dismissed is actually real. And that is true. And I think part of our problem is we tend to eternalize the scientific moment. I think because of our sort of religious perspective in the West, whatever sort of the new information is becomes sort of the scriptural authority. And therefore, whenever new information comes out, it's like, no, that can't be the case. But that sort of misunderstands the very project of science itself. Most people, I don't think, are positioned towards new information to like really take this seriously when it's happening. These kind of discoveries are constantly happening in relationship to things that we would fundamentally say that's from some sort of superstitious era, and now it's just happening in discoveries on a daily basis. And so we have to challenge the way we've sort of framed Newtonian science or any sort of science as there's the final word on it. No, we can't do that. We have to get out of this revelational authority we've given to science and simply sort of keep learning along with it. And if we do that, we open ourselves to saying, wow, like this is fundamentally incredible information that's coming out that we now need to be available for, rather than again create this battleground between the old and the new in information, and hold on to our habitual frames of reference as if they are eternally true.
yeah, it's like a Copernican revolution in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Like a
Yeah,
Galilean. It's like
absolutely.
I mean, they didn't take kindly to that information, as
No.
far as like the religious organization, because it challenges core beliefs, it challenges
Yeah.
foundational stability and egoic
Yeah.
survival. And I think that's the irony of it is the egoic survival is not inevitably positioning us towards survival. And you mentioned it at
Correct.
the beginning, even if we get the feeling of isolation and protection as far as the Anthropocene, you can clearly see that like it's it's not necessarily a long-term game. Like we can't actually play that. And so I think that's where it gets hard to accept these things, because it yeah, I mean it just goes against that sense
Yeah.
of survival that I think we
Yeah.
have, and that sense of
Yeah.
like I can't be wrong. I can't be wrong. Like there's
Correct.
no way.
Correct.
There's no way I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and
Yeah.
I get it. I
No,
have sympathy
it's
for
right.
it, but
And I mean, I think for me that is the bottom line of, I feel like so much of contemporary culture is sort of living in this existential bubble. It's like, no, the bottom line is if we destroy our ecological environment, we can't keep living. There's a threshold, there is an existential threshold in which a certain way of operating on the earth leads to our death as a species. It doesn't it's not it's not a even an intellectual sort of it's not a debate. It's like, I need oxygen to breathe, we need foods to eat. It's not it has become this political argument and even a sort of battle of religious perspectives. And at the end of the day, it's like, well, if this way of living brings us to our fundamental destruction, we got to pause. Like, do we want to just walk off this cliff being right? Or do we want to sort of adapt to the information we're getting from the world that this way of being in the world doesn't work? And unfortunately, it feels like many of us would just rather die being right.
Yeah.
And that's one of sort of, I think, the tragedies of human beings, at least in sort of the way we've pitted ourselves against the world and against information, is like, it's just so fundamentally suicidal of like, I'm going to not make suicidal is not the right word, but I'm not willing to change my information, even if not changing my information kills me. And
Yeah.
that's wild to me.
Yeah. And, and I look at it because it's like, I've got an evangelical background and I've got a lot of friends, and it's funny because I think that, and I was talking to my wife about this, where I think a lot of times when I'll post different clips or videos or have conversations, I can sense that people don't know what to do with the information. Like, it's almost like they don't necessarily, it's like there's parts that resonate with what they've been told or that they see. And then there's parts that are just confusing, or that they're just like, wait a minute, like, what are you even talking about? And I think for me, it's not like, it's not like, trying to think of how to say this. It's not like adversarial of like, okay, here's my position in which this is atheistic or agnostic. I'm going to
Right.
argue and prove to you why this God is not real or whatever, like why your belief system
Right.
is not real. It's not even about arguing the propositions. It's about like, and this is very Vervakian, it's like getting out of the propositional tyranny into
Yeah.
the embodied, perspective, participatory type of living, which is like, that's not controversial. Like, this
No.
is not like, those things are not, it's just unknown and it's
Yeah.
untalked about. And I think that
Correct.
for me, like the imaginal, the symbolic, like, and I had this conversation with someone the other day. We were talking about Christ, and I was like, listen, like, neither one of us can prove whether or not Christ rose from the dead, right? Like, yes, you can make an argument based on this and this, and based on all the facts, like we can make the best propositional argument that this might. Sure, I'm not saying that. Make that argument. But what I'm saying, at the end of the day, your eyes didn't see it, my eyes didn't see it. So at the end of the day, I'm not so much concerned with whether or not I hang my coat on that rack. What I'm more interested in is, how is the resurrection living in me currently? In my phenomenological experience in today's time, what am I doing with the symbolic like quality of what that is inside of myself?
Right.
Because that's literally the only thing I can do anyway. And
Right.
I think like shifting that conversation to where it's like, hey, like, let's put consciousness at the bottom and have the conversation. Let's put the phenomenology at the bottom of what this means and what these religions. And when I see animism, when I see indigenous practices, when I see tantra, when I see all these other things, like, they're not sectarian in the sense of like, hey, like, that doesn't, it's all a framing and a participatory way of embodying and living and engaging with this
Yeah.
animistic world, with this relational world. And I think that at its at a fundamental, it's like, that doesn't need to be adversarial towards your belief. But I do think that like that shift from the egoic propositional belief into that embodied animistic
Yeah.
archetypal world, I guess it's just a scary step. I guess
Yeah.
it's just something that is just it it requires something that I haven't quite put my finger on, like to what you're saying, like you can't understand why people like I think that is something that is really interesting to me too, because
Yeah.
I don't know what that is for people. I don't know. Like
Yeah.
I truly don't. Um
Yeah. No, I mean, we can't have this conversation really without discussing the Christian, not even maybe Christian in general, but maybe American evangelicalism way of positioning belief against experience, basically. And sort of in my upbringing in Assemblies of God, Pentecostal fundamentalism, there was this sort of anticipatory system in place in which whatever you are phenomenologically experiencing, whatever your body is saying, whatever you're imagining, that from the beginning is positioned as suspicious and dangerous. And so there's almost this sort of enveloped self-defense system in some forms of Christianity in which experience itself is where evil comes from. So you have to continually put to death what you're experiencing in as much as it conflicts with what you believe. And I think that that is sort of a very corrosive and for me one of the fundamental impediments to someone saying, yeah, actually I'm not doing well experientially, and being able to trust that. Because again, in some contexts within Christianity, the suffering of our bodies and our minds is itself proof of our spiritual maturation. So it's hard to sort of get around those roadblocks that have been put in place, consciously or not, that prohibit even reflecting on what experience is telling us, because that's where the devil speaks, for
yeah.
to put it bluntly. And for me, that's the in a lot of people, whether they're nominally Christian or devotedly Christian, they cannot ask themselves the question of what is my experience actually telling me, because that itself, that kind of question is even a betrayal of just adhering to what the Bible says or my denomination says. If I'm even questioning if there's something else there that has different input than this, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
And that's hard to work around.
Yeah, it seems like it exposes two things to me. Like in comparison with like the East and like the Vedic traditions, it's really interesting because I've listened to. There's a really great practitioner named Rajarshi Nandi, and he's a tantric practitioner, and he talks about the robustness of the Vedic tradition and how a lot of the Abrahamic traditions just don't have that. It's not as developed, and I think even even that statement to the a Western is like, it's so polemical because you're like, what do you like?
Yeah.
You're insane, you know?
Yeah.
But it's true. I mean, I think the current times are starting to expose the cracks of both our ontological, like the frameworks in which we construct like the paradigms, like, and to be specific, we'll talk about archetypes in a minute, but like within the Christian framework, the way that these forces and energies and these categories get compartmentalized into like angels and demons, or this
Right.
flattened type of literalism that doesn't really make sense in the Western psyche, and yet people believe it because it's the tradition. And so the ways of participatory action with these archetypes don't really make sense in a lot of ways. And the easiest way is because they don't make sense. And the second part would be, I think the practice especially within Christianity and Abrahamic religions in the West, is it gets detached from the shamanic initiatory guidance and practice, in which now a person also has no framework for how to participate with these experiences in a way
Yeah.
that is important. Because I mean, I want you to talk about like what that looks like in the animistic traditions or indigenous traditions, because I think without that, people resort to the non-participation and the propositional stance of, well, I'm just going to believe in the Bible,
Right.
without realizing that that's just a contemplation of all sorts of different iterations that have been passed down based
Correct.
on all sorts of factors. And like trying to unpack that
Correct.
is a lot for an individual, because I think that just doesn't seem possible to be like,
Yeah.
how could I believe, like, there's no way that what I have is not the truth. But when you
Correct.
really start looking at it, it's like there is a necessity for the initiation. There is a necessity for the breadth of what your cosmology can hold
Right.
and how you're framing it. And without that, I think we fall into these fractures that we're seeing. So it's like,
Yeah.
from your perspective, when you think about the initiation and the ritual and some of the stuff I just talked about, what comes to mind with that? Like, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think fundamentally it just requires another aspect that's sorely lacking in modernity in the West in particular, is sort of a capacity to sit still and listen and sort of be available to the world. And I think that in a lot of rituals and initiatory spaces, that is essentially what's being constructed, a time in which the normal inputs of community or life in general are sort of bracketed for the sake of drawing attention to or drawing out a different aspect of our experience and our relationship with the world. And that takes time. It takes a capacity to sit with the unknown and even conceive of the possibility that the unknown can show up and speak to you, change you in some fundamental way. But we don't, that's just not in a, that's not in the texture of how we operate in life. Like we are in a constant barrage of information and entertainment and news, that it's hard for us to put a pause on any of that for the sake of tuning into anything else. And without that, I don't think there is initiation. There is no transformation, because that kind of change requires coming and learning new things about yourself and the world. And that just can't happen when the only information you're getting is from the same sources over and over and all day long. And for me, that's where sort of indigenous ways of relating to the world were built on that availability. Being sort of part of community life is like, we have a history of listening and a history of kinds of practices that work well for making ourselves available. And I think depth psychology tries to do that with active imagination, with these other kind of things in which we trust that there are other energies at work in the world, but our conscious frame of reference may have pushed them out or excluded them or labeled them in ways that kept us out of relationship with them. And the hope is we learn how to get into that relational space again and be able to listen and be surprised.
Yeah.
That's just very challenging, particularly with this Christian frame of reference in mind, in which, again, any other kind of voice that shows up is already
Labeled.
categorized. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and there's like 7 different directions. I like so much that I'm thinking, I'm trying to channel this in, because I think that, to me, talks that highlights the archetypal components of the initiatory practice. Because from my experience, both with my practices and through studies and through other just like reading and witnessing, it's like every tradition, every practice has a relationship to the archetypal forms. That's baked into the cosmology. And I think the problem that seems to be that we're facing is like that symbolic framework is so flattened, so literally
Yeah.
flattened, that we don't understand. Like we can't. Most people, it's like this idea of like the thing that they've rejected from what you're talking about, the categorized like demon, right? It's like, well, I don't believe
Right.
in demons, and it's like, yeah, I don't believe in that kind of demon either. Like I don't, or like there's certain things where it's like I understand, but when you start talking about things symbolically and start talking about not in the sense of not real, but the sense
Right.
of we don't have enough capacity in words and like imaginatory functions to describe these things as they are. So we
Yeah.
have to use the metaphorical, the embodied practice of what we're doing in order to elicit and to transform something that we're experiencing relationally to it. So it's like
Yeah.
we have to have that type of I almost see it as like training, right? Like it's
Yeah.
a muscle,
Yeah.
right? Like, and I see
For
these
sure.
rituals as ways of the mantras. I see them as ways of training and ways of, you talk about sitting. It's like these are
Yeah.
ways to shift from that propositional mind, intellectual mind into an altered state in order to then, relate. And so to me, I think that's like archetypally, where do you see that playing in as far as the best way you found to talk about archetypes? Because I mean, I know that's even in a conversation of itself where you talk about depth
Yeah.
psychology.
Yeah.
That can get a little
Yeah.
bit interesting with how people choose to approach it versus with. I would argue that maybe there's a difference between someone that holds the animistic perspective with the archetype and then maybe someone that is a Jungian that is into the archetypes, but they don't hold the you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's
Yeah.
a
I
difference
mean,
there.
I think maybe one of the things that to truly appreciate an archetypal perspective requires a loosening of a sense of what in your mental life belongs to you. And uh, that might not mean anything, but from an archetypal perspective, um, our fantasies, our dreams, even our thoughts are not sort of just the things we're making inside our own minds. And a lot of the challenge of sort of getting people to recognize archetypal elements of their experiences, because again, we've assumed that whatever's going through our bodies and minds is ours, rather than as our experience of things alive in our psyches, in our bodies that we're experiencing. But to get into a real archetypal way of framing things, you have to be open to the fact that maybe dreams is as maybe the best analogy of things show up in your experience. And when you're asleep, you obviously didn't will those. You weren't sitting around thinking. There's some other thing at work in you that is showing up in other forms with faces and dramas and activities, and you didn't make those. And therefore, part of an archetypal perspective is recognizing that there's some other element to either your psyche, if that's how you want to frame it, or reality itself that can show up in ways that aren't willed by you or intended by you. And if you want to take another step, those ways that the world or symbolism or images show up to you have meaning. They're communicating. They are bringing something to consciousness that you didn't previously know. And again, you didn't make up. And if you start to sort of massage that sort of sensibility of recognizing where did that thought come from, or man, I just got in a mood, where'd that come from, and open to the possibility that you are sort of moving through an environment of things that can show up in your experience that aren't yours, you're starting to move into an archetypal perspective in which you are surrounded and inhabited by other energies that make themselves known to you in your experience that, again, aren't yours for the making. They show up
Yeah.
to you.
And what do you feel like with the Indigenous perspective as far as the practices and the rituals that were a part of different groups of people? What are the ways that that impacted or shows up or changes or enhances? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that makes
Yeah,
much sense, but
absolutely. No, I mean, that is the experiential world of Indigenous communities in which a dream is information. So a medicine person or even some other community member could have a vision, have a dream, and the community takes that experience seriously as communication. And so a community could say, this kind of dream occurred, and it tells us that sort of we're going to have this kind of winter, or the crops are going to be in this kind of cycle. And therefore, we're going to prepare for how we inhabit our space in a way that takes into consideration all the information that people are getting, both internally and from the environment itself. And so it positions us to not exclude any input. And I think that that's part of the richness and sort of survival necessity of this, is because one of the things that we're lacking, we've sort of cut ourselves off from every other information source in existence, but maybe our own logic or something like that. And in Indigenous communities, you take all information as communication from the world. And over time, you learn to trust that information. You learn that we gotta pick up and move to this area. The the food in this area or this time of year is not well adapted to what we need and what this environment needs, so we go elsewhere. Or whatever sort of decision or thing occurring, nothing is left out of what is taken into consideration. And that adds just layers of other inputs for people to use to respond to the world with.
it's interesting too because as you're saying that, it makes me think of this concept of or the thought of remaining simply in logic or the idea in the buffered self. Like
Yeah,
I think just because a person believes they are a buffered self most certainly does not actually make them a buffered self.
no,
And so I
correct.
think that that's where it gets really interesting because what I notice is these things are going to continue to happen.
Yeah,
Whether or not whether or not a person becomes aware or they don't, it's going to happen and the archetypes are going to inform and move. Like we are
correct.
and that's why I see as a or as somebody that's PhD psychology and transpersonal psychology, it's like I look at these different models of CBT, behaviorism, humanistic, like all these models in which we are trying to approach this problem with almost it's like dealing with these archetypes and people that are in these symbolic eruptions or psychosis or whatever you want to call them, but a refusal to maybe look at an avenue of what's below the surface that's informing
Yeah,
this information. And it's like, I do think that there are things you can do that will create an effect. I'm not going to discredit those modalities, but what's funny, it's like, it almost feels like trying to show up for a game having no practice, having no like not like kind of winging it as you go, as opposed to not knowing how the system how like what's actually going on.
correct.
And so I think that's what's to me it's interesting. Like when I think about the lack of when I think about that belief that we have buffered ourselves off, and even and this part might get a little controversial, but I think it's important to go there. Whereas I think that within the Christian framework, there is this propositional belief that we can obtain a belief in something, and therefore now we have achieved immunity towards certain energies or towards certain
Right.
frameworks. And what I find interesting, it's like when Christians or other people will look at practices, indigenous practices that seem odd or seem like, why are they going through that type of painful initiation type of practice, or doing this thing that just seems so primal or tribalistic or so foreign? And they're like looking at it with a sense of judgment without realizing like the amount of energy that they are now suppressing by not participating in something and then projecting it out. It's almost like kicking it in, as opposed to like the indigenous where it's like, no, we deal with it as it, we move
Right.
the energy as it comes. And that's why these practices are important. And I feel like the West is, within Christianity, it's like we adopt these things. It's like, oh no, like once we have the correct vertical belief, now that type of stuff doesn't really matter. All that
Yeah.
matter, like, so
Yep.
I see it problematic from that perspective in
Yeah,
many
and I mean,
ways.
another element to this is that at a fundamental level, a lot or most Christians have located their well-being to another place and another time. And again, what that means is like I don't need to really pay attention to the sources of my suffering or what is sort of starts inhibiting my ability to function well in the world. I can even take that as sort of a star on my chart that I'm not doing well in this world because I shouldn't be doing well in this world. My home is elsewhere. And again, it creates these weird isolation chambers in which the body and mind are speaking. As you said, it's not as if we actually shut off these channels of communication, but they are so interpreted that we lose their communication. I mean, for me, at the end of the day, I really trust reality's capacity to get through to us. And maybe that really fundamentally in some circumstances requires some dire situations for us to get the information. But in my own experience, and that's, what I can go on, the the obstructions the world put in place in my own symptoms, in my own body, got me the message eventually that I was excluding necessary parts of life. And I think the world is able to do that really well, even despite the tenacity of our resistances. I mean, and if it couldn't, none of us will make it if we were left to our own devices, I think. So I really trust the wisdom of the cosmos to be able to know what would get each of us and even collectively get us to the point where the reality of the thing is more powerful than our belief against it.
Yeah.
And that may be a platitude, but that was my experience, and that's what I trust.
No, I think that's the big reason why these conversations exist. Because in my mind, and again, I don't want to, like, this is not intended to be polemical as we critique or talk
Yeah,
about these things. I think it really truly is like, I think that there's different ways of approach. There's different ways that these doors will be opened, whether or not it's through
yeah,
hardship or the trickster or some type of
yeah,
whatever it might look like. I think this is a part of it. And again, for me, I just keep looking at this situation, and the heart behind the way I see it is like my phenomenological experiences led me into places in which I did experience. I mean, I was a social worker in Las Vegas and saw people that would have these archetypal eruptions where people might call them possession states, or these unexplainable things in which people were expressing information that was beyond their experience. It was like
yeah,
they lost faculty over their bodies. They were talking
yeah,
in different voices. Like, it was to the point where there is no there and honestly, like, those experiences, I mean, hundreds of times, is why I'm doing what I'm doing, because
yeah,
I didn't find the framework in which I was operating to be sufficient in, like, fully explaining what was going on. And then when I got in academia and people started trying to reduce these things to pathological realities, that was equally to me. I'm like, this is inauthentic, because this is not describing the event as it happens.
Correct.
Like, you're doing the same thing that many people do, where it's like, as an avoidance tactic to deal with what could potentially be a reality, we can label it as something else and call it something else.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that really led me into like a genuine pursuit of like wanting to understand and wanting to know, like, from an open place where I'm challenging, like, I'm probably wrong. I have to keep like learning and keep experiencing. But through that, I think that one of the things I've realized was that the outreach center that I worked at was interesting, because it was a space, it was a container in which people would come into. And I don't know if it was just the environment that we set or what, but these things would start to happen without eliciting them.
Right.
It wasn't like I was like doing therapy. Like, I was helping them get food and clothes, and we would do basic information like name, and I would be talking to them. And like, as we're talking, this person's like, the voice is telling me I have to get away from you. And I was like, well, do you want to leave? And they're like, well, no, I don't think so. But it's saying, run, get away. Like, this is not, and it's like, okay. And then we start talking, and she just loses control, and she's like out and like talking in this voice, and then coming out on the other end, like, what just happened, you know? And so for me, I'm like, wow, okay, so something's happening. And here was a space in which seemed to have an environment that opened up these doors and opened up these things. And then when I transitioned out of that, what I've noticed within society is that there are not a lot of spaces in which that type of understanding or access or ability to, even within the therapy session, it's like, it's hard because people, I think, a lot of times are so conditioned towards talk therapy or
Yeah.
something in that
Yeah.
sense. Uh, Yeah. And it's also like, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this. It's like, it doesn't matter what we believe in. Like, you could be like, well, I believe I'm a Christian. I think a lot of Christians have this belief. It's like, well, I'm a Christian, and this type, I can't be affected by certain types of archetypes. I can't have those things because I'm this.
Yeah.
Then you realize you're like, well, that's certainly not the case.
Yeah.
And it almost makes me feel like there's this false initiation that kind of happens, that people, or I don't know how to put it, but it's interesting to think about, because it's like, I think that's why I'm attracted to the Indigenous, because it seems like they not only had the belief system, they not only had the cosmology and the practices, they had the rituals, they had the spaces. There was a buy-in in which the community valued the shaman. The shaman was a part of the community. Like, they had all of that together, whereas society today seems to be a little disjointed in that sense.
Yeah. No, I mean, for me, that's one of the reasons I think Indigenous peoples and traditions are sort of absolutely necessary to these conversations, because no matter how congruent the scientific information becomes with a sort of animated kind of conscious cosmos, what is lacking in that is the history of living that way that is in Indigenous communities. And so one of the dangers is to just make this information intellectually something, but if it's not a way of living, that, like, it's serving no existential purpose. And so if you want to know what it looks like to live in a living cosmos, you look at Indigenous communities who have the wisdom built of living that way in relationship to their contexts and cultures. And for me, that's the only way where this becomes sort of flesh and blood ways of being, and prevents us from just making it another interesting thing that we tack onto our academic pedigree, or whatever the case is.
It, it was funny. I was reading Custer Died for Your Sins, or Vine Deloria Jr.'s book, where he's the chapter on anthropologists, and it was just, I was dying laughing because it was just so funny the way he talked about like the
Yeah.
cycle of the anthropologist studying and critiquing and then
Yeah.
publishing and then going back, and like this cycle where it's like
Yeah.
nothing, there's no adaptation. It's like
Yeah.
it was one of the funnier chapters, but it made me think of that because it's like that. I think that is the trap, and that's what the last thing I want to ask you. And I think this is a good lead into this because I think this is the thing that I think about, and anybody that's going to go down this road, eventually, I think you hit this point where you start to feel, especially if you're in the West, especially if you're just white, like there is an isolation that begins to happen where you start feeling like, oh man, I'm cut off from
Right.
so much. I can't go back. None of us can go back, and I don't think we should go back. And I think that to go full circle with the conversation, like AI's coming, the world's changing. Like we're on a Zoom call right now talking about these
Right.
things. Like this is like we're already in such a different landscape to try to like idolize or utopianize the past is pointless and irrelevant. But at the end of the day, the conscious development of, you mentioned the world's soul taking us and trusting in that process. I tend to look at it as like there's a reason the project of modernity was it can't just be an error that was like pointless. Like it can't just be a falsity. It's like there's something that's happened that it is what it is, and now here we are. And I think about like the Lakota people where they established themselves in a certain place that wasn't like they had been there forever, but they moved into the land, they transitioned, they understood how to adapt and how to
Right.
plant into that. So I think in a similar fashion, this is too big of a question to ask you. Like, how do we do this, Dylan? Like,
Yeah.
how does modernity like become the new? But I think, yeah, like that's just something that is. I don't look at it as bad. I don't want to go back, but at the same time, like I think we have to get to a place where we like move forward, accepting both what is and what was and what can be learned. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it goes to the fact that what we're talking about isn't a propositional belief system, but a kind of sensibility for the world. And I think Indigenous communities today are living this way now on Zoom calls and with technology uh, in a way that's sort of not disruptive to the cosmos that they inhabit. So it's not again, I don't think it's sort of like recovering a relic from the past that's, as if indigenous communities only existed, 5,000 years ago. They're existing now and living in adaptive ways, both with an animistic sensibility in relationship to the same modern world we're inhabiting. And I think maybe one of the important things to point out is that most indigenous communities are, as you described, they're living in relationship to the context of the world they inhabit. And therefore, it's not sort of a universalistic prescribed something that all of us have to sort of believe in the same way. It's a capacity to be in relationship to where we are in a way that is in service to the well-being of the whole of that context and environment. And so the way we do that is not trying to imagine into some other people's way of being that way, but to be that way ourselves right now in our environments. And to me, that doesn't require appropriating or borrowing or taking on something that doesn't belong to us and doesn't feel authentic to us. It means, can I learn to have a kind of sensibility towards the world in which I am listening right now in my environment, to my body, to what I need to do to be of most benefit to the whole. And if we can learn how to do that, then we are just living the thing now. We're not leaping over history. We're not borrowing someone else's. We are trusting our own sensibility of humans, of our own human sensibility that humans have always had to be able to live well in their context by listening to that context well. And that's how we, to me, that's how we do that now, because I can't do it in some other place, being some other person. I can only do that as me, where I'm at, and that's where this lives, or it doesn't live anywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard a snippet from Bio Akumalafe. I don't know if you're familiar, but he was describing a story where a group of people from all different countries that were coming together to try to get back in touch with their heritage or their ancestral roots, and they were essentially like trying to tune in to say like, okay, what practice do we need to do? Like, where do we
Right.
need? They asked the gods and they prayed or whatever that what the ritual was, and that night, several of them had dreams in which this figure came to them and instructed them on ways of ritualizing this practice that they were searching for. And the thing that it said to do was to take selfies.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
thought it was so beautiful because it was this representation of that syncretic adaptation of these
Yeah.
archetypes and these moving gods that are roaming, and I
Yeah.
think that is a huge part of what we're talking about, I think, and that being okay with that and being
Yeah.
able to move into that
Yes.
space where it's like, okay, like this is a part of it, and that adaptation and that the flux
Yeah.
of what's happening is every
Yeah.
bit vital.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, we can tend to eternalize indigenous communities, but the rituals within indigenous communities grew out of somebody's contemporary dreams of that moment, or grew out of a communal ritual or scene or dance or vision, and was a response to that information at that time of this is how we respond to the world that's calling to us. And so we can tend to sort of freeze that in time, but that's not how it works. It happens exactly like this of I learn how to do that in response to what I'm being asked to do now, and therefore I'm not looking at this as if it never changes or never changed. That's not at all true. These rituals and ways of being grew out of the relationship with with the time and the moment and the place. And that's the only way it grows again, is if we can be present in that way now with what shows up to us now.
Well, I think that's where we should end it. I could go
Perfect.
on. I feel like I could probably like there's like so many other things that I'm like, God, it brings up so much more, but I feel like that's a good place for now, and then we'll just have to have a good excuse to do this again in the future.
Perfect.
But in the meantime, do you have a space where people can go to? Do you publish stuff, or do you have a website, or do you have any books or anything that you want to throw out there?
I think right now the best place of sort of informational intersection with my life and work is my Instagram account, which is I think Dylan Martinez Francisco.
I'll throw it in the show notes.
Perfect.
But Dylan, I am really thankful that we had this conversation, and I
Same.
honestly, I'm hopeful that the future looks like more of these conversations with just people. Like I said before, part of I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a intuitive gift or if it's a just how I am, but there is a sense when I'm talking to somebody of kind of touching kind of the almost like touching the back of their psyche to see where they've gone and just their ability to hold. And when I'm talking to you, I feel like I can just reach and it just goes so deep and it goes in such a vast place. And I thank you for that. I enjoy talking to people like that just because I think it allows the space and that flexibility to truly kind of explore and open up to new possibilities as opposed to just constantly trying to defend or prove or critique or whatever. So I really appreciate that about you.
Well, I'll echo it back. I mean, I think your experience that you described at the community where people showed up in ways that they may not have in other contexts. I think that's definitely a gift you carry into spaces of like not being a blank space, but being available both as you and to whatever the other wants to, the person or information or whatever has is a can show up and not be show up as they are. And I think that takes a great deal of maturity and egoic plasticity and permeability, and you hold that well of being you and being available. And I'm really glad you're doing this podcast, because I think that makes a lot of things possible that other ways of holding the way people hold themselves creates agendas and unspoken no-go areas that warp what can happen. And there's something unwarped about your presence that is really
I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I think and that is inevitably, I think the whole impetus behind wanting to grow the community is to provide spaces in which people can carry in these types of burdens and energies and these closeted parts of the psyche. And I think when I look out through the podcast land or through the publishing land, I see a lot of that. I see a lot of spaces that are either explored in a way that feels a little bit ungrounded or feels hard to kind of place, or it's like to the point where the questions of experience and practice and being able to say like, I did have this really crazy experience or this crazy dream and I don't know what to do with it and I don't know where it fits in this intellectual framework. And I think that we need more spaces like that in order to be able to allow those things to kind of come up in ways that people can resist the urge to build a metaphysical paradigm around and put it into it's like, oh, this happens, well, this means XYZ. It's like, who knows? And so, I think
I think it's very congruent with what we just talked about. Is the only way you actually do this is by like being in this kind of relationship with others. And so you're living that way in the way you're doing these, that I think is sort of creates a really nice energetic signature of I'm doing what I'm wanting to see done. I'm being authentic and integrity to this vision of the world being able to speak by being that way when I'm present with others. And so there's a really beautiful symmetry, might not be the right word, but congruence between your intention and how you're actually doing it.
Well, thank you for that, man. I really appreciate it. So everybody, check out more of Dylan's work. Dylan, thank you again.
Thank you, Trey.
Hey guys, before you go, if I could ask you one quick favor. If you enjoyed this video and you got something from it, I would sincerely appreciate it if you would like and maybe subscribe to the channel. Every bit of engagement helps. And in the meantime, if you're curious to check out more content like this, maybe check out this video or that video. Yeah, that's a good one. And don't forget to subscribe.